I'll make it easy on everybody, and I'm just going to go down the row, starting right to left, and we'll have everybody introduce themselves. So, Kent, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, John. Kent Knight with Elkus Manfredi Architects. We were involved in the New York Genome Center as the architects for that design.
I can remember. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Aronne. I'm a senior vice president with Hunter Roberts. You were introduced to some of the projects that we've been involved with by Jimmy a little earlier, but I've spent most of my career building laboratory buildings around New York City, and most recently these 3 projects at BioBat and the New York Genome Center and Stem Cell Corporation. I've had the pleasure of leading those efforts.
Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Horch with JB&B. I'm an associate partner, and I worked with Brian and company on the New York Genome Center. We were also involved with the New York Stem Cell Foundation and 375 Pearl as the MEP engineers.
Clete?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Clete Casper. I'm Director of Real Estate for Sabey Corporation. We were involved on the IT side with the New York Genome Center and have been working through the adaptive reuse of 375 Pearl, otherwise known as the ugliest building in New York.
By the way, it's much prettier from inside. It's the only place in New York you can't see it. And Lois.
Hi, I'm Lois Mate from Ennead Architects. I'm an associate partner there, and we were the designers for the New York Stem Cell Foundation Research Institute.
Awesome. Okay, so Ken, why don't we start with you? And so what does a scientific company look for when they consider leasing space? What do the users, the scientists, really want?
Well, I think we've talked a lot today about connectivity, not only in their workplace with the computers, but also face-to-face connectivity with their colleagues, with people doing like science, and also just connectivity in the live, work, play environment that they're in. They want to have dinner, have lunch with their colleagues, and get together. I did bring, John, just a couple slides of Genome.
Sure, I love Genome. It's one of my favorite projects.
Let me just take a few minutes and introduce Genome for those of you that may not know about it. It is in the Hudson Square neighborhood, right at that corner, right near Tribeca and Soho on Avenue of the Americas. This is the entrance that we were able to create to the building. It's about a 24, 25-story building. It was completely repurposed. There had been unions in the building, window washers unions, et cetera, that occupied the entire building. Minskoff, who was the building owner, completely, when the unions moved out, he completely renovated the lobby, destination dispatch elevators, new restrooms. And Genome, as you can see in this diagram, took basically the first 7 floors. On the first floor, they have their own conference center and cafeteria. There is a mezzanine at the back of that floor that serves for meeting space as well as some of the lab functions such as the minus 80 storage for the cryo storage. The second floor we have mechanical space and some space yet to be fit out. The third floor is where the J labs are going. 4th floor is all research lab space. The 5th is the genetics labs, the sequencing labs. And the 6th floor is bioinformatics. The top floor, the 7th floor, which has the roof decks, is for their executive offices. This is one of the sequencing labs. We had some challenges with floor-to-floor height as well as the structural load. We met those by actually reinforcing the slabs and doing an open ceiling concept where we could. You see through the glass panel the sequencing labs, which do have ceilings. But flexible lab, casework, overhead utility carriers. The sequencing machines there in the bottom corner. In the other slab, the slide, the research lab space. You see, if you look closely, some of Chris's handiwork with the chilled beams there, which saved on overhead ductwork height. And then what we've all been talking about is the important breakout spaces, whether it's the roof deck, the boardroom here, these sort of soft seating collaboration areas for breakout meetings. And because the floor plates weren't that large at Genome, we actually interconnected every other floor with communicating stairs. That's just a quick overview, John.
Okay, so just a couple of things. One, I obviously have a lot of friends in the room, but for people who don't know me, my name's John Mechanic. I'm the head of the real estate group at Fried Frank, and we had the pleasure of representing the Genome Center in going to 101 Avenue of the Americas. As just a footnote, when Genome was looking for its space, there are actually very few spaces where the zoning in New York actually permitted the use that they were looking for, so we had a limited set of alternatives. We were actually looking for an alternative space. We got down the road, but couldn't conclude there, so we had a very active landlord in Minskoff in chasing us. We were a great use and great for him repurposing the building, so he chased us to come there. And then it turned out that there were many aspects of the building that were actually suitable for us, and the zoning was suitable for us. The zoning has since become more user-friendly for this use, and so it's there are a greater variety of places that people can go to, and other people can speak to that. But I thought I would just kind of footnote that. And one question, Ken, a lot of the things that you talked about don't seem very different from other users. When you talked about connectivity and collaboration spaces, I mean, I represent a wide range of tenants, and when you're talking to architects today designing their spaces, you have that being discussed in and not just biotech, but in all kinds of different uses. Do you find something that's specific with respect to biotech that's different from those things in terms of things that you're looking for when they're looking for what space they're going to?
Well, I think you're right, John. It's true these days that the world is more and more connected. I think what makes life sciences unique is their specific requirements. It's much more demanding than just office space. So as you just pointed out, they can't really go anywhere. So they're limited in locations they can look at. So the buildings that do suit their needs, some neighborhoods may be better than others.
Okay, Brian, what building qualities and characteristics are most important to ascertain compatibility with life science development?
I think you can be creative in a lot of different ways, reusing these buildings. So where the Genome Center is a concrete slab building. It was built as an office building. And as Kent mentioned, structurally it didn't work on the laboratory floors for the vibration criteria and some of the loading requirements, so we were able to work around that. We worked with the low ceiling heights by exposing a lot of the ductwork and not having hung ceilings, so we were able to creatively look at that as well. And then the other big piece of all of these buildings as we go through these efforts is looking at vertical connectivity. We need to get a lot of these services back up to the roof. The Genome Center was an excellent candidate because we had second floor mechanical space that was previously a machine room, and we were able to utilize that space to serve the lower part of the building. But we also had to get to the roof, so we were able to negotiate with the landlord a vertical shaftway that we were able to build to get ourselves up to the top. And when we evaluate all of these buildings as we went through with Genome, and also when we had the stem cell experience, trying to find ways to get to the roof is a critical and expensive part of what we have to evaluate as we look at these buildings.
Brian, how important was it that 101 Avenue of the Americas was actually vacant? And so when you went to create that vertical shaftway, it was easy for the landlord to be easy, not inexpensive, but easy for the landlord to make that space available for you because he wasn't going back to tenants saying, by the way, excuse me, but I'd like to take out a piece of your floor because I need to give it to this particular tenant to run stuff up to the roof.
Yeah, the timing of Genome was perfect because, as you said, the building was empty as we moved in. So we were able to capitalize on that and get ourselves through the building before the rest of the fit out had just begun as we were opening Genome. So we really did have a great opportunity timing-wise.
Chris,
Just to piggyback on that with the empty building is that we had the first shot at getting the mechanical space and getting roof space and things of that nature. So it actually helped us significantly in terms of the negotiations and getting the right mechanical spaces for the life science needs.
had to be the quality of the team involved, right?
Absolutely.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, you're number one, John. By the way, John gets paid by the word, so if he continues to talk, we'll just interrupt him.
Chris, how about repositioning a building to accommodate the mixed use of office, laboratory, and retail space? How hard is that?
Every building is unique. Every building has its own story. Every building presents its own challenges. And in today's world, an office building is not just an office building anymore. You've got a data center, you've got retail, you've got cafeterias and conference centers and things like that. And this is no different, right? You're putting in a laboratory that has office space, that has conferencing center, it's got a small cafeteria, it's got a data center. It has all that. It just happened to be at the bottom of the building where the most, heavy mechanicals wanted to go up through the roof. So you're transferring all of that exhaust and things through the office portion of the space. So when we looked at this building, we took it one step at a time, and we tried to use everything that the office building had to offer from an MEP systems, and then leverage that and then bolt onto it as opposed to starting from scratch. So this was a floor-by-floor DX system, so we leveraged that for the office portion of the floors so that our laboratory systems were dedicated just to the labs, which helped us reduce the size, reduce the shaft requirements, reduce the chiller plant and those things that were specialty just for the laboratories. And likewise, we leveraged a generator that was there. And like I said, the cooling towers, we were able to leverage that. And it actually, the building had substantial power to it. So we were able to leverage what the building had to offer and then supplement that with those needs for the laboratory itself.
I mean, so I think it's fair to say, even though the building wasn't designed for this use, there were things that were attendant to the building, particularly with the mechanical and electrical systems, that were actually very helpful to us in terms of being able to utilize it for the purposes we wanted, which might not be in a standard office building if you were just making the conversion.
That's what I just said.
Okay, good. We agreed. Clete, how can the cost be reduced? Is it possible to reduce cost by sharing or outsourcing? And can you be helpful in that regard?
Glad you asked. If I could grab the clicker there. So we're from Seattle, and we have a niche there in the life science community, and we have done a number of rehabilitations or adaptive reuse of manufacturing buildings. We're in the middle of our project at 375 Pearl. But I think the biggest opportunity, and we're, as a landlord, not only do we develop these things, but we're a long-term owner, and so we operate them. And so the biggest thing that we've found is if you have the right infrastructure, then that's the most important part in the long-term ownership, because, like Sven suggested, the industry changes, the people change, the ownership changes, and you just have to plan for change. And so if you have the right infrastructure, beginning with the floor loads, beginning with the floor heights, beginning with the location, and is it in a location that does appeal to the entrepreneurial set, then those are the primary initial foundations of creating a great biotech building. And at 375 Pearl, while I mentioned it was the ugliest building, we think we're number 2 now.
Do I dare ask what number 1 is?
We've heard Madison Square Garden, but
Oh, okay. Well, I think there's a competition we're gonna do later, and the winner gets $1,000.
so while New York looks at this as maybe the ugliest building, we look at it as a beautiful building, especially when it relates to the IT infrastructure that's necessary to support a data center environment, and also perhaps a life science and office multi-use project. We also look at the region, and in Seattle, what we've experienced has been a number of clusters. Not only is there one cluster for the R&D and the headquarters facility, but there's also a suburban quality, like some of the panelists have talked about, where there is a different requirement for pilot manufacturing. It needs to be less expensive, it needs to be bigger, it needs to have growth opportunities. So we've kind of focused around Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn as areas of focus for us, and where we would like to expand into the life science side. Here are some of the components that we were really attracted to. Once you peeled off the panels, you had fantastic views of New York, the downtown skyline, the Brooklyn skyline, and really a unique asset from the inside out. And you can see the ceiling heights there. Our top floor, we have 23 feet. most of the floors are between 15 and 16 feet floor to floor. So a tremendous volume, and that's something that we always look for. So when you're looking at where do you reduce your costs, the ability to have that high ceiling, to be able to move mechanical systems, move electrical systems within that space. Over the long term of the project, things are going to change. And then the most important aspect of our building is the IT infrastructure that is there. And we were able to locate the cages for the New York Genome Center in our lower floors, a cost-effective basis with unparalleled access to connectivity and power.
So, Clete, can you just clarify for people, so how do you interact with Genome Center so that you really are an off-site facility that's really doing a lot of the work that they could have done on-site but was very expensive for them to do, and so they managed to conserve their cost and the amount of space they needed to take by using the facilities that you're making available to multiple people?
Yeah, the cost of a data center, if you do it on-site, is expensive. And not only is it expensive, but you have to have the expertise to maintain it and to continue to operate it. So what we're able to do in an outsourced manner is take that cost, move it outsourced, and effectively allow the capital that would be deployed on-site to be kept used for other purposes like recruiting, hiring new people, new scientists. And what this allows is not only a great platform for the initial requirements for New York Genome, but also gives them tremendous scalability. We have a number of floors that are in this configuration, and we also have expansion. So it's an opportunity, like we talk about a little bit in Seattle, is taking these mission-critical facilities, put them in a location that makes the most sense, and defer that initial capital expense to a specialist that knows what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and it also gives the Genome Center a level of disaster recovery, and we can't understate the resiliency and redundancy levels. We, as a designer, we could design that on site, but the cost would go up tremendously. So to be able to leverage an adjacent building or building down the street for this purpose is tremendous, and that's one of the unique things of New York is that this is right in our backyard. You're not going to Omaha, Nebraska. You're not going 7,000 miles away. It's right here in the backyard, and it's just a T1 or a 10 gig connection away.
But Chris, is this duplicative of stuff that's at 101 Avenue of the Americas, or is this separate and distinct? So would you need something that was redundant to this in case of a disaster that affected 375 Pearl?
It's a combination of things. We do have a small on-site data center for immediate needs for the bioinformatics. This is long-term storage, and then there's a DR portion as well. So there's a combination of things in order to give that redundancy and resiliency, because the Genome Center trades on information, right? The information is the most valuable part after the sequencing. So to do that without the resiliency or redundancy or disaster recovery would be, would potentially cause a real issue for their business model.
Okay. Lois, so we've talked about some of the MEP characteristics of these buildings that are trying to be repurposed. What about the architectural characteristics that are critical to repurposing an existing building floor plate for life sciences / laboratory use?
Happy to tell you about that. Let me show you a little bit about the institution and the building. So New York Stem Cell's story is a little different than that of the Genome Center. The New York Stem Cell Foundation was founded in 2004 by Susan Solomon and her partner as an independent nonprofit trying to bridge the gap between research institutions and biotech companies. Their mission was very personal to Susan. They wanted to use stem cell research as a way to find cures for the major diseases of our time. They were operating in 2015 in 2 different facilities. Their headquarters were in Midtown Manhattan. Their laboratory was up on the far west side in the Audubon Center. I think it's the center, that was owned by Columbia. They wanted to bring their 2 facilities together in one collaborative hub. They wanted to be able to improve the conditions of their lab, to provide a showcase for their very specialized research, and they wanted to create a space in the building where they could have and sponsor programs for the life sciences community. Their objective was to find a location that they could afford, that was central, that a building that had architectural and MEP that they could build on, and they wanted to design and move in very quickly. So what they found was 619 West 54th Street, a building that was managed and owned by Taconic Investment Partners. It is a 330,000 gross square foot building, a commercial building with 10 floors, a variety of different occupants at the time. Similarly, the zoning in that neighborhood was good and could facilitate their conversion of 2 of these commercial floors for laboratory use. The building had good bones. It was built in 1930 as a movie lab for Warner Brothers. It had large footprints, about 33,000 square feet, natural light on 3 sides, a robust structural system with a nice column spacing for labs 20 feet on center. It did have very small floor-to-floor heights, which did create some complications, which we were able to work around. And again, it did have some available MEP systems and lease space on the lower floors and space in the basement. They could create new MEP systems that they needed to support the high-intensive laboratory that they were creating for stem cell. A couple of things about the building. There was a courtyard in the back where they had a parking lot where they could put an emergency generator for their specialized use. They also were challenged by the fact that the building was almost fully occupied. So they had to figure out how to run distribution to the roof and to the cellar of the building, actually on the outside of the building in the courtyard, which was quite a challenge. So what we were able to do, they took on 1.5 floors in the building, a full floor on the 3rd floor where they could put their laboratory, taking advantage of windows on the north and on the south side for their workstations, for their administrative staff, and for their scientists. And they placed the laboratory in the center of the building, coincidentally, in an area where they had a lot of piping for the tenant above that we had to work around, and created some constraints in the area of the building where we had the most high-intensive MEP distribution need. They also connected the 2 ends of the building with a gallery that would connect the scientists and the administrative staff. A double height connecting stair to a lower floor where they had one flexible open common space that they could fit out in a variety of ways from a furniture point of view. Also a big space for food and for hosting the community that they would bring in for various symposia. One of the requirements was really to create as much open space as possible, a lot of workstations, very few enclosed offices, and the laboratory and the offices are all encased pretty much 100% in glass to allow light and visibility into the lab.
How did you deal with the floor-to-floor height limitations? You said you found creative ways to deal with it. What did you do?
We have ceilings in the central lab area, no ceilings in the workstation areas. But it was really a lot of coordination, the use of BIM to be able to very strategically work around that existing piping. We ended up having to obviously put drip pans in because it's over the most sensitive space in the facility. Yeah, it was a challenge.
We also leveraged chill beam technology
Yes.
in order to help reduce that quantity of outside air and the air change rates. So by doing that, you're able to reduce that mechanical sandwich in order to help, Brian coordinated and make sure we get the ceiling heights that Lois wanted.
Great.
Yeah. Go ahead. Do you have another question?
No, I'm good. Did you?
I have one more slide.
Okay.
So I think one of the most exciting things about the story here is that stem cell opened in January of 2017, and it really, as an anchor tenant in the building. It really became a model for what this building could be used for in terms of serving the life sciences. Taconic was able to use the facility to encourage others to be interested in coming to the building and to, in fact, turn this building into the Hudson Research Center. So in August of 2017, they, along with Silverstein Properties, announced their plans to develop 150,000 square feet of life science wet lab research space in the building and committed another $20 million to upgrading the infrastructure of the building to create lab-ready space. And as you can see, it's one of the sites in the city now where life sciences folks can look to find space.
Did they have any pre-leasing commitments before they committed to upgrade that space? Or were they relying on the STEM Research Foundation to, in fact, attract other people and to use it as a showpiece for other people to come to the space and making the bet that, in fact, if they build it, they would come?
I think it was the latter. They understood the value of the architecture. They understood the value of the client and the way that what they were able to make of this space in order to encourage others to come and to consider this as a potential site.
How much were these other tenants being able to capitalize on improvements that you made to the building that would actually benefit them as well, where they could kind of piggyback on things that you had already done, which they wouldn't have to do because you did them already?
I think that we can look to Taconic and their commitment and investment made after the fact to have created that.
Great. Ken, when tenants are looking for space, how do you distinguish one building location from another? What separates a building from the competition and has one stand out as a place to go to? Obviously, the Taconic, by having the investment that they're making and by what they've done is an easy example. But what are the other things? How do you look at when you're looking and looking at different alternative locations for potential users?
Well, I guess from the perspective of a user looking for space, again, you're going to look for what's the neighborhood like? What sort of area am I moving my company into? What's the quality of life for my employees in this area? I think you're also going to look, as we heard from the other panel, if you're expanding at all, which and we planned in Genome for growth from the initial startup to a 2-year growth, 3-year growth, and then even 5 years when they would be dense packed and need to start expanding. But a lot of these companies, as in the case of the Broad, they grow at a tremendous rate. So they're very concerned about expansion and where they can make that next move. So those are a few of the things, I think.
Okay. Brian, what are the infrastructure upgrades that you would be recommending for office building type structures to support life science development if, in fact, somebody's looking at space that's coming available and they're thinking, okay, you know, life science is kind of where the world is going to. I need to kind of upgrade my building and to make it user-friendly for the life science community. And they turn to you and they say, okay, what do I do? What would you be telling them to do?
Well, we've acted as part of a team on a number of occasions over the last dozen years in evaluating different types of buildings for this type of upgrade. So we've worked with Chris and his team on a number of projects. And really, you know, you start electrically and you look at the electrical service that's available to a building and what type of upgrades are potential. You're looking at what the building is using on a daily basis electrically. You're looking for emergency power. And there are different levels of infrastructure that can be provided. So, you know, we mentioned the stem cell. They made a decision that the Stem Cell Foundation was really on their own. So the development that we did there, all of the infrastructure upgrades were there just specifically for that development. They did not look at it holistically as a building upgrade. They looked at it specifically as a tenant upgrade. So we've been involved with other projects where you're looking at it in a much larger sense and you have, you know, a positive outlook that you're going to be doing this type of development in a larger scale. So the infrastructure upgrades you're looking at are much more across the board for all floor development as opposed to a single tenant development. So you can piggyback off of a larger boiler room, off of a set of exhaust fans and a riser set up going up vertically through the building. you can look at that in a much broader sense, and that will pay off over the long run.
So, Brian, I mean, we talked about, and Lois talked about the fact that when, and you just said, that when Taconic did the development for Stem Cell Foundation, they were focused on solely the stem cell use and upgrading the building for the points necessary. Now that's done, it's been very successful, and now they're coming back and say, okay, now we're going to invest $20 million to upgrade the balance of the building so that we can attract more tenants of that type. If you roll the film back, 2 years, 3 years, and they were coming to you and say, hey, you know what, this is a great idea, and not only can we do this for stem cell, but we could do this for a broader community of life science uses, what would you have done or advised them to do differently so that they could, for those next users, piggyback on what they were doing for stem cell, and how would that have affected the cost of the infrastructure that they were building? Because at that point in time, they would know what they were doing, as opposed to doing it in 2 stages, where they realized that the first stage was very successful, and they said, this is great, why don't we do this for round 2?
Well, I think it has to be supported by the building owner. The timing aspect of stem cell was such that there was interest in some of the upper floors that were up for leasing, and there was some life science interest in the upper floors. And they came to the building looking at what stem cell was doing and was hoping to be expanding some of the things and the infrastructure upgrades that we were doing. But it had been too late at that point in time. We had released equipment. We were already developing a project for a specific 33,000 feet of a floor plate, and we weren't doing it for 2 floors or 3 floors. If the decision had been made earlier, we could have easily upgraded the systems that we were providing to support these additional floors of development.
Yeah, as I get, and Lois, maybe you can weigh in. So if we're looking at other people who are looking at upgrading their buildings and they're trying to make those judgments, and they may have one life science tenant that they're talking to, but if they're looking forward and thinking to themselves, okay, I'm doing this, but I really have an opportunity, what would you advise them? I mean, you guys are experts, professionals. What you'd be talking to them and say, hey guys, before you do this, why don't you think about doing the other thing?
It's about
Lois?
flexibility and scalability, right? So from an MEP perspective, you can do, you want to look at it 2 different ways. You've got your mechanical systems where you've got to bring air and water to the facility, and then you can scale from there, right? If you need a chiller plant versus a DX, whatever it is. But you want to make sure that you've got enough scalability to where you're putting in, your day one needs, but leaving enough roof space so you can flex that for the future. You're putting in enough riser sizes, pipe sizes to make sure that you can scale that to tap off to other tenants in the future. The other thing is electrical power, so normal power and emergency power. Again, flexible and scalable. Once you put in, you're going to put an emergency generator into a building, to upsize that chronologically, the cost uptick is not overbearing, right? So you put in a little bit more power so that you can scale that for other tenants in the future. Again, riser sizing, things like that. But you have to look at it from a holistic perspective, right? You take a step back and say, okay, what does this building really want to be when it grows up? And the key to the whole thing is that an office building and a laboratory, the incremental steps from coming to a 21st century office building that meets the energy code and does all the things that you need to do to be in the market for a Class A office, the scalability to a laboratory is not 2 or 3x. It's x plus 15%. It's 1.5x. So you look at it from a holistic perspective, and if you do that out of the gate, it's relatively easy. If you do that too late in the terms of stem cell, they looked at it after everything was bought and under construction. They said, hey, wow, this is a great opportunity. Let's figure out a way to capitalize on it. At that point, the horse was already out of the barn.
So
Lois?
I think timing is everything. We heard on the
I heard that.
We heard on the previous panel that 3 years ago, 5 years ago, we weren't looking at New York City in the same way as we are today. And I think Stem Cell was an independent nonprofit just looking to increase their facility, and I don't think that the atmosphere in the city was probably where it needed to be for Taconic to have understood in advance when we were trying to plan this building in late 2015, early 2016, where this would go. If they could have seen that, if what was going on at NYC EDC had been a little bit further along in the process, it might have been a different game, but we weren't there.
Okay. Clete, what's new in laboratory design and FF&E that allows for cost-effective flexibility and growth? Because obviously, some of these tenants are coming in, they're taking whatever the square footage, maybe it's one floor on day one, but that need could expand so dramatically. So how do they plan for that? What would you advise them? How can you be helpful?
Well, I guess looking back, we've been doing labs for 20 years now, and I think the major change that you've seen maybe in some of the pictures is the lab furniture is modular, it's on wheels, and the idea that you can reconfigure without getting into serious construction is the most important change that's happened. And then I would say that the second change and the things that we're seeing, and you see it with the sequencing machines that New York Genome has, is so much of it is becoming computational sciences. And when we are looking at planning new buildings, we're looking more at the expansion on that side of the equation, not so much the wet lab. So what we're seeing anyway right now is just the flexibility, modular style lab systems, and then the need to expand on the computational side.
So whatever walls are going up, if walls are going up in the space, are they all just not going up to the ceiling, so you have flexibility about where you move things around and what furniture configurations you have? So in fact, you're not doing construction every time you've decided that there's a better way to configure the space?
We're seeing the core laboratory areas, and again, a lot of the design is shown here, with glass, so that the ability to interact and see what's happening in the lab, and then outside of that area is more flexible, open, without the need for every investigator to have its own private office, and that's been a trend that's in office and in research development.
Lois, in what way does planning a purpose-built lab vary from the planning of an innovation or startup lab?
It's providing specifically what your client needs. I think about the difference. Well, I think about the difference of how we would have planned the building if it was more generic. Probably the basic moves stayed the same. Would stay the same, but it would be what would be in the center that might vary, depending on program.
Ken, if we were going back, so we've lived through the whole Genome Center, trying to get everything done, 3 or 4 months earlier than whatever it was planned for, in order to accommodate the requirements of the leader of that whole endeavor, Nancy Kelly, whom we love dearly. So if we now, having had the benefit of that, and you're talking to the people in the room about the most important lessons that we learned from going through that process, and I asked you to tell people what they were, what would you say were the most important lessons we learned from having gone through that process?
Well, so I was thinking about this morning, and Genome was no different than your project, Lois. And it's true with all of these science projects. The delivery to the client for the space is paramount. We can't get the work done fast enough. And I think what's really critical is, and I think our team had great coordination, but I think that can always be improved upon, and that's coordination through the whole process. You were working on the lease deal as we were actually designing 2 or 3 properties at the same time because we weren't sure where this was going to land.
By the way, we were negotiating 2 or 3 lease deals at the same time, so we were doing that in tandem.
But the point is, we worked with Nancy and her team on the programming piece. Nancy brought Hunter Roberts in early, as well as the owner's project manager. The whole team started from day one, worked very intensely. But the collaboration really extends to all the other parts of the project that are needed to make it work. The scientific equipment that has to show up. We went out to Illumina to look at the high-seq instruments. There's AV requirements, there's security, there's tel data. All of these pieces have to come together. They've got to come together quickly, and each consultant really has to do their job to get all those ducks to line up the way they need to.
Okay. Brian, what would you say would be the timeline for the design and construction to perform the necessary infrastructure upgrades on an office building. Both the real timeline, Nancy's timeline, and we'll talk about what the differences might be.
They're all so different. It's hard to actually, we were talking about this earlier. I would say there's probably a good 6 months of design time and surveying time necessary to really understand the building that you're moving into. And then from that point, both the Genome Center and the Stem Cell Foundation took approximately 6 months to build. Nancy wasn't happy with our timeline, but we were able to get her in successfully. But, round about 6 months for those types of developments.
Chris, at what point in the design or construction process would it make sense to have the construction manager or general contractor on board the team in order to help facilitate the overall development, making sure?
Yeah, Brian would love to answer that one and say before the other
But
members of the team
Brian
show
would
up.
say, like, it's the first guy you hire,
Exactly.
right?
Brian's like, yeah, right out of the gate, just send me a check. No, but the right answer is that in order to build an appropriate team in this day and age and have a collaborative effort and really push this thing through, the construction manager really wants to be on board as early as possible, right? Especially in these adaptive reuses, Brian saw things that none of the other team members did because he has to build it. He's got logistics. Does the freight elevator work? Are we going to have to crane things in? Do we have to do overtime work? In lease negotiations, how many hours do I need on the elevator? Am I going to be able to get the workforce up and down? In terms of pre-purchasing equipment to try to, again, meet Nancy's schedule.
It's a bad rap.
Well,
By the
meet
way,
schedule
and
in
the only
general.
reason everything got done and when it got done is because
she drove
whatever we
us.
were supposed to get done, Nancy wanted to get done like 60 or 90 days earlier. And consequently, we got done when we were supposed to, but it was only because she kept pushing everybody to get everybody where they needed to be. So,
Right, so-
while it's not really a bad rap, it's really that she was totally focused on getting us done.
Right, all joking aside, but being able to pre-purchase equipment, have it ready to go as soon as, the design documents are completed. And having Brian on board and Hunter Roberts on board early is a significant help to the team and really pushing us forward.
If I can just add to that for a second, because we saw two different types of timelines between the Genome Center and the Stem Cell Foundation. The Genome with Nancy, the team was created prior to site selection. So we actually went and surveyed buildings all around the 5 boroughs and were part of the team in making that selection. And we prepared budgets for various, different buildings that we were interested in and some test fits that we had done. So there was always a clear level of communication about, how expensive this was going to be. These are expensive developments. There's a significant amount of mechanical infrastructure that needs to be put into these types of developments. When we got into stem cell, we got into it at a much later point in time. And, when we initially started creating budgets for it, the sticker shock, I'll call it, of the type of expenses that were out there was something that was a surprise to them as an organization, the amount of cost that it was going to take. So it was a different set of timing, and I think coming in early and understanding that from a financing perspective, from a fundraising perspective, it's an important part of, how to make a successful project.
I mean, and I would say that we, in the Genome Center case, we had gone down the road with a building that actually worked for us zoning-wise, and on an economic basis, if you look straight at the economics, it was much more attractive. When you started filtering in, as we did the design and all the things that we needed to incorporate into that building, which hadn't had some of the built-in benefits that 101 Avenue of the Americas had, as you did that calculation about what we'd have to put into that building, which seemed on its face to be a less expensive alternative, it became clear that even though the rent in the other building was significantly higher, the overall net effective cost to the Genome Center was significantly lower by going into the building that had things that were built into it ahead of time. So unlike, the Stem Cell Foundation, there were things that we didn't have to do that were already there, even though there were still upgrades that we needed to do. So having that insight at the outset as you're going through site selection and as you're going through, it's really what the net effective cost is going to be for you in terms of the things that the improvements you're going to make, as well as what the ongoing cost is of carrying the space going forward, and the ability to make sure that you've got all the variables in place when you're doing that site selection is obviously critical to coming up with the right decision for whatever tenant or entity you're either representing or whichever tenant entity you are. Clete, when we talk about these projects and recruiting and retaining talent is obviously a major component. Necessarily if you build it, they may not come depending on where you are. So what do you think helps attract and retain that that talent?
Beer,
Beer in large quantities?
large quantities of beer in multiple outlets.
That, by the way, that can be in multiple locations.
Yes, well, I guess the fact is that recruiting is a very important part of the successful long-term operation of the entity. And so I think quality of life is a broad answer to your question. We found that if you can find that manufacturing building that has some component of view or waterfront or park that layers onto the physical qualities of the building, that really helps. That a lot of these individuals are high-powered individuals coming from San Diego or San Francisco, and you need to give them something that has that cool factor.
Lois, so the benefit of including these communal or common spaces in the life science development, now that you've done the Stem Cell Foundation and kind of people are living in that space, what kind of response? I mean, you have like the real live example of how people are responding to the spaces that you designed and created, and how important has that been, and what kind of responses have you gotten to the way you've done the space? And having the benefit of those responses, are there any things that you would say, you know, if I had to do it over again, I might have done this or I might have done that?
This is going to sound terrible. I think that the space is a huge benefit to the New York Stem Cell Foundation. It's an enormous open space, and every time I've been there, I've seen it filled with people, not just people eating lunch together, but people collaborating at a table, on a couch. They have, I know they have this at New York Genome Center too. They have ping pong tables, they have things that they can do, and it's really important for researchers who have such a important and stressful job to be, this is the whole live work thing, right? They need to have a place to relax, come together, and I think that it's something that every life science facility should include.
Okay. And I would open this to the panel generally. So in terms of people who are thinking of developing existing spaces into life science spaces, if I had to ask each of you kind of what do you see as the biggest challenges, why don't we just go down the list and see what people think, because I think we're coming toward the end of our session, and I think people have to understand what it is. You know, everybody would like to go out and make their building into a life science center, and somehow I think that's probably not likely to occur. So I've asked each one of you to say what you think is the biggest challenge in that regard. Why don't you tell me what you think?
Well, I think every building is different. I think the biggest challenge right up front is just getting your arms around the issues and what the solutions are going to be and what cost you're looking at to make it work.
Okay.
Our biggest hurdle was the zoning criteria, the manufacturing criteria originally, and as you said, that's relaxed to a degree now, but 5 years ago when we were looking,
It was impossible.
That was a huge piece of the puzzle. So.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing about a building that you cannot change is the structure. So finding the building that has the right bones is probably the single most important thing, and then after that, it's vertical connectivity and shaft space for us.
Okay. Clete?
I think for us, it really boils down to the return on investment. At 375 Pearl, we had a opportunity to do life science on a larger scale, but the return on investment for conversion to office and doing a long-term lease with the City of New York was a much better return as we looked at it. And I think that's what you see here in Manhattan is the alternative investment profile of doing office, of doing residential or mixed use is still very compelling compared to the risk profile of maybe a startup life science company. So it's a challenge on that front.
I agree. Lois?
I would just say time and money.
That's bringing it down to the lowest common denominator. It's time and money. And by the way, if you would make both those things work, then you can make it work. I think I want to thank the panel. I think the panel has been great.